My presentation today is on Maimonides on the way of purpose versus the way of necessity, divine will reconsidered. So I guess to start, I wanted to call out two quotes by Maimonides on creation. The world's being created in time, according to the opinion of our law, is not impossible, and it should be accepted without proof because of prophecy which explains things to which it is not in the power of speculation to accede. We contend that God brought the world as a whole into existence after non-existence and formed it until it has achieved the perfection as you see it. Prima facie presented by Maimonides as two ways of putting the same anti-Aristotle view of creation versus eternity, I'd like to highlight that these two claims are not necessarily synonymous. One of them uses the expression created in time, the other one slides into a different locution of existence after non-existence. It is the emergence of these sorts of slippages between phrases in the guide, coupled by his lengthy introductory flags about the method of his work, and not based on dogmatic commitments to Straussian reading, that leads me to remain uncomfortable concluding that Maimonides upholds creation in time, or at any rate that he upholds a sense of creation in time that would prevent him from embracing a Proclean and or Avicennian sense of an eternal created world, which is to say a created world that, while generated from nothing, is not created in time. So in essence, Proclus and Avicenna are two perfectly reasonable ways, they offer two perfectly reasonable ways to think generated, created, and eternal together. And for many textual reasons, I tend to see Maimonides as engaging these sorts of ideas. So turning to Proclus, Proclus argues for the idea of an eternally good God entailing an eternally good world generated by him. For Proclus, God is both the final and the efficient cause, and on the eternity of the world, he notes Jude, or generosity, was always a cause for the being of the cosmos, because the coming into being of the cosmos was congruent with the being of the Maker, for we do not find anything which in any way could have only made the world because it is good, and yet not be making it eternally while it is eternally good. So this essentially coming from a tradition in the Timaeus that you find also in Plotinus, this idea that an eternally good God would be eternally the generator, creator of a good universe. And then in Avicenna, following a different line, but also worth thinking about in a similar tradition, he says, if something by virtue of its essence is a cause for the existence of something else, it prevents the absolute non-existence of the thing. It is the one that gives complete existence to the thing. This then is the meaning that for the philosophers is termed ibda, creation. It is the giving of existence to a thing after absolute non-existence, lysa mutlak. For it belongs to the effect in itself to be non-existent, lysa, and then to be by its cause existing, isa. Hence, every effect constitutes an existence after non-existence, isa ba'da lysa, in terms of essential posteriority, from the metaphysics of the healing. So here, essentially, Avicenna providing a unique modal ontology. He provides a new understanding of creation ex nihilo, or I don't know, new. It's certainly not the first one. You could find similar things in the Jewish mystical tradition and other contexts. But just in terms of thinking about a certain trajectory coming out of late ancient into medieval thought, Avicenna switches the modal ontology in a way that allows for a certain approach to creation ex nihilo, and no longer taken out as a temporal claim about beginnings that would be at odds with eternal Plotinian emanation, but a way of referring to the status of contingents, which are in and of themselves, absent that is a relation to God, nihil, nothing. They are, in other words, utterly dependent on God for the existence. Here, not only creation, but creation ex nihilo, seen in Avicenna's emphasis on the giving of existence to a thing after absolute non-existence, which again, where the after has been transformed out of a temporal to a ontological meaning, is completely consistent with and indeed a manifestation of eternal divine emanation. So again, Proclus and Avicenna, two perfectly reasonable ways to think generated, created, and eternal together. And for many textual reasons in Maimonides, I tend to see Maimonides as engaging these ideas. And so just to give a broad sense, if, for example, if we had compelling, sustained evidence across the guide to read Maimonides with Avicenna and or Proclus on this point, we could certainly see how the second quote above might be Maimonides' subtle refocusing of in-time talk, in quote 1, to existence after non-existence talk, thereby shifting from a temporal to an ontological meaning of created after time in the spirit of what we just saw in Avicenna, and thereby enabling a deeply different sense of creation in time for the remainder of his work. Instead of trying to convince you of this way of reading Maimonides, I thought today I'd simply explore a few related difficult moments in Maimonides' account of divine will, that even if not slippages in support of my preferred reading, are at any rate complex details that will benefit from careful attention, if only to try and better clarify what he is saying. So in sum, these are some of the ways the sort of Proclean Avicennan approach is something that I read in the folds of Maimonides. I won't just sort of make that direct attempt today to make that point, but what I will do today in terms of looking at just some complexities is not just in and of itself an attempt to look at some complexities, which will be helpful for clarifying some of what he's doing in his account, but in addition to that, as it relates to this broad frame, is that I find it upsetting that the way the discourse in Maimonides scholarship sometimes proceeds is that either you're a careful reader of a text or you are committed to Straussian reading for some unknown reason. And I don't consider myself committed to Straussian readings. My Maimonides scholarship never went through that particular pathway. That said, I do see slippages in his text, so and that I would base on his own methodological introduction to his own work, which, yes, Strauss picks up on, so I'm not sure why that would be a problem, but it's just something to emphasize in all that I'll be presenting today. At the very least, in addition to, again, just clarifying something per se, at the very least, I would also like it to just be an example methodologically of what I mean by slippages, and the kinds of complexities and difficulties in what he's doing in his accounts of creation. As again, I won't make the paper about how that methodologically proves that he's following Avicenna. That will not be my path, but it will be, again, so two things that will come out from today, I hope. One is an elaboration of certain difficulties in the text or complexities in the text, which I found useful to go through. So hopefully you'll find it useful per se. And then again, just side note, which is it would also methodologically give you a sense of a kind of confusion or complexity or double talk or something odd that's going on in Maimonides that might be unintentional on his part, or might be an example of what I mean by slippage, just to give you a sense of the kinds of ways that, for me, these slippages, as it were, result from close readings of the text, not from some broad methodological commitment prior to the text, or separate from the text. Okay, so in our attempt to understand Maimonides on divine will, it's useful to start out by demarcating a number of extremes that he seems to be pushing against. Like Six Blind Men and the Elephant, we'll try to piece his view together from these various what it is nots. So we start with the analysanda, order, nature or nature's wisdom, and just the right amount of God. These are, for Maimonides, obviously all intertwining ideas that are connected. The notion of a God who brings nature and natures and order through his wisdom. So just that entire matrix of things with lots of other implications is obviously a core theme of Maimonides in his guide and beyond. And so when I say let's start out by demarcating some extremes he wants to be avoiding, I'm going to put that in terms of he's trying to avoid too little of this stuff as well as too much of this stuff. And let's see what I have in mind with some examples. So if we look at the threat of too little side of that formula, there are two in a way opposite, based on reasons we'll see in a minute, atomistic ways to get to a sort of too little order, too little nature outcome. The first is in the Kalamic atomisms and occasionalisms. There's basically no nature to speak of, and so that would be way too little nature. And in a different way, Epicurus is mentioned throughout as the advocate of chance, so we could just broadly speak here of Greek atomisms, and whether there is some nature to speak of or no nature to speak of, let's just say this would be another way to encapsulate what he finds to be problematic about Epicurean chance is, again, it's too little nature or order to speak of. So here's where the opposite part between these two comes in. If we think about the Greek atomistic approach, we might say on the God level that God is too absent. There's not enough God. Whereas, interestingly, for the Kalam atomism, the problem is, if anything, that there's too much God. So that's what I mean by these are two opposite atomistic ways to get to too little nature or too little order. Both of them are emphasizing one through chance, one through occasionalism in a way that provides Maimonides with the sense that there's too little emphasis on order and nature in these theories. And then again, interestingly, one of them is doing so by focusing too little on God, and the other one by focusing too much on God, or giving God, in the case of Kalam, too heavy a hand. God, we could say, is too present, too much providence. God guides every leaf through its descent with no nature. So these are some of the oppositions that Maimonides is working to avoid throughout the guide. And we could add to the threat of too much side, in a very different spirit, the idea of Aristotle, a critique of Aristotle for too much necessity that he talks about in Guide 219 and elsewhere, and that will occupy much of our time today. And in this respect, there are two senses in which he means too much necessity for Aristotle. Too much necessity, not in the sense of some kind of predetermination necessity in that respect, but rather necessity in two very specific senses. Either the idea that Aristotle, for him, things non-existence is not possible, and then relatedly, and it's in this related locution that we'll focus on today, his concern that there's no change possible in the way that things' natures are for Aristotle. As Maimonides says, that for Aristotle, everything must remain permanently as it is according to its nature, and that's going to be a critique for Maimonides. And so again, just looking at this matrix of threats of too little, threats of too much in various different senses. And if we add to the critique of Aristotle on the threat of too much necessity, we can add another major critique. In 317, Maimonides critiques Aristotle for, let's call it, an anemic sense of providence, anemic in the sense that it's only related to the supralunar, and Maimonides is concerned it doesn't address the sublunar sufficiently well. So if we think about this matrix of too littles and too muches, where should we add the critique, his critique of Aristotle for this anemic sense of providence, which again is related to his sense that for Aristotle the heavens are in a permanent changeless state that Maimonides is okay with. He says when it comes to the sublunar, he says the sublunar, he says it's not neglected in every respect. After all, says Maimonides, Aristotle fully accommodates for the faculties and the resources for the preservation of individuals and species in terms of embryology and in terms of other kinds of ways that things are set up. So that, he says, is all okay. But Maimonides says that Aristotle at the sublunar level provides us with no way to distinguish the cases of a spider eating a fly and a ship sinking with righteous people. So I'm going to leave aside that I don't necessarily take that example at face value in Maimonides based on various other textual cues across the guide. But let's just prima facie at least say that this is his critique of Aristotle. He's fine with the first two bullet points. The heavens are permanent. Lots of faculties and resources at the sublunar level is another way that you see providence even at the sublunar. But he says that in the sublunar, no way to distinguish the spider case from the righteous people drowning case. Let's just start with that and take it at some level at face value. Clearly, this is somehow related to his critique of Aristotle as having too much necessity, and that's going to, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's just say, if we leave out analyzing it just in terms of eternity and creation, my goal in today's presentation is to try to avoid that language as much as possible and to try to look at details that are at the finer grain level so that we don't just slip into our most favorite rehearsed view on whether he upholds creation or eternity. So I'm going to try to avoid those terms. But if we look at these details as we have them here, we could say that in 317, the critique can be seen as a version of the necessity critique in a way where, as we said, that Kalam has too much God and not enough nature. Aristotle's supralunar approach related to his very necessitated understanding of the permanency of nature winds up, as we saw with the Greek atomist problem, having not enough God. And so in this respect, we can put onto the matrix both this 317 supralunar critique on the one hand is a version of the too much necessity critique because it's sort of the too much necessity is looking for this kind of permanence, and therefore there's a tendency to focus on the supralunar in a way that maybe leaves things at the sublunar falling short. And then in a way of adding that to the too little side of the matrix, we can say that what comes out of this, if we want to understand the nature of the critique, then is that in this case with this with the ship of sinking people example, that there's in Aristotle's providence account not enough God. And so that's, again, just using this matrix, for me at least, as a way to clarify and sort of get started with some ideas of what he's interested in avoiding. And so here we could talk about a quadruple threat, and here I've broken up the material from the previous slides in a slightly different way. So if we break up order and nature, or nature is at one level and think about too little and too much, and then if we think about God and something that God brings in too little or too much, again we have, when it comes to order and nature, the various atomisms give too little order. Aristotelian necessary natures gives sort of too much of a rigid focus on order. And then in the God case, we have the too little and the too much that we've seen. And what's interesting in the God case is that, it's not entirely clear how to put it. If we want to say God's providence is what we're thinking of, we want not too little or not too much of God's love, God's care, God's fill in the blank, something about God that we're trying to have. We've seen again that in the two Greek examples, there was that we've seen the Greek atomisms and Aristotelian providence, that there's too little of God's hand, or however again you want to fill in that blank. And then on the too much side, we saw the Islamic atomisms, and I would add here Pinnes's work on Stoic providence as providing too much. In the case, also a kind of too much for Maimonides, of too much God presence, God hand, etc. So actually, if you want to think then about what it is that the perfect balance or the perfect scenario is for Maimonides when it comes to God's fill in the blank, God's presence, God's hand, God's manifesting, this is precisely where Maimonides brings in, for the purposes of our discussion today, the notion of divine will, connected with al-ikhtiyar, the prohairesis, sometimes translated as free will, but let's just say decision, and an important phrase for our work today, the notion of al-kest, purpose. So when Maimonides is talking about divine will, wherever one might start with a discussion of divine will, this is where I would like us to start in thinking about divine will off the bat, in the context of this quadruple threat, it is a middle path, maybe is one way to put it, if you want to think of it that way. It's a middle path really on both on both of these orders, on the order nature and the God issue, since these are all intertwined. It's for me, where I want to start thinking of it is in that respect. It's the middle path, the perfect blend of not too much, not too little, and it's related to this notion of al-ikhtiyar and to this notion of purpose, al-kest. And so let me also then, for the purposes of the paper today, say that instead of looking at all of the matrix and how it fits in the middle of all of it, I'm just particularly going to want to focus on how it fits in the middle of vis-a-vis not falling prey to the too much tendency of the Aristotelian necessary natures approach, and not falling threat to too little of the God piece in the Aristotelian supralunar providence. So again, the divine will and purpose winds up being in the middle of all of this, and I'm going to focus on it being in the middle in terms of these highlighted elements, that it's not too much nature and it's not too little God. And so it's in this context that we're now better able to understand and appreciate what I would call two competing poles that occur clearly in Guide 219 and in other places in the guide, that I, for one, benefited from sort of working through, and hope you'll benefit from having me work through in this presentation. But that's really something that that's part of the goal today, is to understand what these competing poles are. And hopefully the matrix already gives us a starting place to see what is at stake. And the two poles that emerge in 219 and elsewhere are two ways that things can exist. Either things exist in virtue of purpose and specification, and this is Kest and Taxis, or they exist in virtue of necessity. And it is in this context that I'm trying to unpack better what that contrast would be. And so already based on what we've said, it can hopefully be clear that the virtue in virtue of purpose and specification, which for abbreviation I'll just refer to as in virtue of purpose throughout for the remainder of today, this sort of purpose pathway, this reflects Maimonides' idea of getting it just right about God. We can say that these ideas, Kest and Taxis, together with will and decision, that these, we may say, are the parameters of his idea of divine will. And this, on the other hand, the in virtue of necessity, this reflects Maimonides' concern with what he describes as what we've seen as an Aristotelian shortcoming that presumably also relates to and implicates that other shortcoming of that's Aristotle's anemic sense of providence. Okay, so this is the context in which we are addressing the Maimonides today on divine will. And we might add that with the divine will piece, this of course connects up with the idea of a creator God and efficient causation and the languages of al-Bari, al-Fa'il, and these are all intertwined. I won't today be able to work through some of the details on efficient causation, but really all of the pieces related to this in virtue of purpose are critical to understanding what he's doing with divine will, with the notion of a creator God who is an efficient cause. So it is actually, even though I won't be mentioning the notions of al-Bari, al-Fa'il in the discussion, let me just frame it to say that I take what I'm about to go into about purpose and getting clearer on what it is and isn't, is to be all directly related to understanding what divine will is, all directly related to understanding his notion of creation, and all directly related to understanding his notion of efficient causation. Okay. So again, in other words, without just resorting to a sort of, does he go for creation? Does he go for eternity? He goes for modified eternity. Let's just leave all those words out. The goal is really to understand that whatever is on green on this slide is presumably what Maimonides wants from a view, whatever words we use to name it. Okay, so again, we've sort of, now this slide hopefully has some context and makes more sense and gives you some starting intuitions. This distinction between two ways for something to exist, in virtue of purpose and in virtue of necessity. Again, in virtue of purpose, connected up with will, decision, purpose, specification. That's al-takhsis, an efficient cause, and in virtue of necessity, again, for this Aristotelian idea that something exists by virtue of necessity, in the sense of exists necessarily by its nature. It can't change its nature, and its nature can't be otherwise. Those are the operative senses. Again, it's not some predestination idea. It's this sense of that its nature, it can't change its nature, and its nature can't be otherwise. That's really the kernel of in virtue of necessity. Okay, so with that framework in place, now let's turn to a quote from 221. Now as for us, Maimonides says, all things exist in virtue of a purpose and not of necessity. This is further, he then goes on, he further glosses this in terms of God's being able to change their purpose. However, he says, but not to, quote, absolutely any purpose whatsoever, end quote. And he here clarifies that although he doesn't want to, again, back to our sliding poles of extremes that he's trying to avoid, he doesn't want to go into the Aristotelian in virtue of necessity. This is what's at stake for him in claiming that God should be able to change purposes of things. However, because he also doesn't want to slide into Islamic occasionalism, into kalam, he then qualifies, he says, well, yes, God should be able to change their purpose, but not to absolutely any purpose whatsoever. And he explicitly there says, because he doesn't want to fall prey to kalam atomistic occasionalism and its mistake of doing away with nature so much, that it's too much. And so in here respect, we can say Aristotle's in virtue of necessity does not have enough takhsis, whereas Islamic occasionalism has too much takhsis. God is sort of moving every leaf down down from the tree to the floor. And so again, thinking of everything in terms of what he's trying to avoid. So this is what he wants us to understand by his claim that all things exist in virtue of a purpose. God can change their purpose, but let's not go nuts, not to like any purpose. So again, that's a rather precarious position in terms of sort of saying, oh, this gives us a very clear understanding of his view. It's helpful, at least for me, to see it between what it isn't and what it isn't. Back to the six blind men and the elephant, it's not supposed to be too much necessity like Aristotle, and not enough specification, divine specification, but it's not supposed to be too much divine specification, like with the Asherites. And so we have what it isn't and what it isn't, and I just want to highlight methodologically that's great. I do think that is helpful, at least for me, but I also want to specify or clarify that that is not exactly the same thing as saying, oh, he gives us some really clear criteria for what the divine will is. Again, let me just, again, in a somewhat dramatic way, state it this way, in a way that makes it sound a little suspicious. Oh, I'm calling out that I'm right now designing to make it sound a bit suspicious, but here's how I'm doing it, is saying, let's not say that there's, you can't change the purpose at all, but let's not go nuts and say that you could change it too much. So again, that's just my way of saying, at the sort of uncontroversial level, he is saying that. He's saying it's not, you don't want to be too much with Aristotle or too much with Kalam. But my other point is that it's not so clear then what exactly it means to be too much, just right, like just get it just right. As a philosopher, I would, sort of hope he would spell that out a little bit more. And since he is a great philosopher, that's an example of a kind of moment where I think something maybe is not 100% clear. Or, let me state, it is not 100% clear. That doesn't require further glossing. But where I kind of come in with a little bit of gloss is say, maybe that's a moment where we have to think twice, since it's not exactly clear what does he actually intend for us to be reading in here. So again, just to be clear, it's uncontroversial that there is something confusing here and unclear, I should say. What's maybe controversial is whether you want to read into that, and I do tend to read into that, but that's not the way I'm going to proceed today. But again, I just want to back to the beginning frame to just give a sense of where I find things that I would call slippages, or in this case, it's not exactly a slippage. It's more of a very unclear situation at the exact moment where we would want absolute clarity. And that just is, again, as an aside, part of how my method approaches the guide in the spirit of his own introduction. That's not informed by some overly dogmatic sense that, oh, he's definitely not saying what he means to be saying for no reason or because somebody said that and I take Strauss at face value. It's not based on that. It's based on, this is an example of where when I read the text and I wrestle through for a number of weeks to see what is he talking about this in virtue of purpose versus in virtue of necessity. And then I realize, okay, yes. And then I think, well, that's an unfortunate place at which to sort of say what he's doing by what he's not doing, because this is divine will, after all, that's being explicated. And yes, it's great to know that it's not Aristotle and it's not Kalam, but what does that exactly mean? And then, etc. So that's part of the reason that that leads me to an Avicennian Proclean. But again, I'm not going to spell out how I take those steps. I just wanted to flag the method as to why I consider this a moment of, if not slippage, a moment of confusion where it's not clear what he wants us to think divine will is, even having described it in between these two poles. Okay. So back to just the sort of task of trying to hear what he's actually saying here, and not necessarily like what to do with what he's saying here, just back to what he's saying. So he here ultimately wants to chide Aristotle for being too dead set on order, in the sense of assuming wrongly that reason can deduce whys for all superlunar details. So again, we've just now gone through how it's, Aristotle has too much necessity, Kalam has too little necessity, if you want to put it that way. And now let's say a little bit more about just going to the Aristotle side. What does he mean that it's that this is too, what is the problem exactly with this necessity issue for him in Aristotle? So in particular, he's seeing Aristotle as being too dead set on order, in the sense of assuming, from Maimonides' perspective, wrongly that reason can deduce whys for all supralunar details, on analogy for how reason can for many sublunar phenomena. Aristotle suffers, in other words, from a kind of epistemological hubris rooted in an unfounded confidence that there is a necessary, which is in part to say based on nature's and therefore subject to human reason, why the sphere moves from the east as opposed to from the west. Aristotle wrongly thinks that this kind of reason would be on analogy with why a bit of earth, when thrown upwards, falls downwards. Something regarding which, with Aristotle, Maimonides does think there is a why related to the nature of earth and air. And so the issue, another way of putting the issue of this in virtue of necessity, is that it entails, or it assumes that there is a necessary order, that the natures, if they're necessary, then that order, it means that it's knowable, that it has a why that we can ascertain through knowledge in the way that we can with sublunar phenomena. And that's why I call it epistemological hubris. The real issue is not just that it's hubris, it's that it's a hubris related to an understanding of there being a necessary order in the universe, which is, if there were a necessary order in the universe, then it would not be hubris. Then it would be maybe a big task epistemologically to know it, but it wouldn't really be hubris. The hubris is specifically related to an incorrect assumption about the way that the world is ontologically, that it is set up in this necessary ordered way, in a way that then we should be able to figure out the whys, and that is what Maimonides is calling into question. Furthermore, it is precisely this that is the source for Maimonides of what he thinks of as divine will. So here's some quotes related to this. In 219, Maimonides says, Aristotle wished to assign causes for all this so that these things would be ordered for us in a natural order that is due to necessity. And yet, to take the example of his account of the sphere's eastbound motion, Aristotle has assigned no clear cause with regard to this. So Maimonides is saying, even Aristotle himself can sort of see that his own accounts, when it gets into some of these supralunar phenomena, don't really make any, they're kind of spurious. And so Maimonides is sort of counseling Aristotle to recognize that he's sort of on the wrong track here. And then as opposed to what he says about his own view, so he says, Maimonides, for we say that there is a being that has specified just as it willed every sphere in regard to its motion and rapidity, but we do not know in what respect there is wisdom in making these things exist in this fashion. So this is a very important sentence here. And so here, Maimonides, it's essentially here. I mean, again, I don't know, maybe this is just an overly simplistic way of putting it, but for me, it's somehow very important to emphasize that this is where he is introducing divine will. This notion of divine specification, al-takhsis, and this willing, this is essentially the introduction of divine will. You could say as a placeholder, but that's not really the right way to say it. He's coming to the conclusion that there needs to be a divine will to the extent that there is not a knowable order. And in fact, he says we don't know in what respect there's any wisdom in making these things exist the way they are. And instead of just saying, and therefore, who knows, it's a big mystery, or, and therefore, let's just sort of believe in chance, he therefore, at that moment says, and therefore, divine will. So that's a very important point to emphasize, that at least in this dialectic in the guide, divine will is being introduced as, is being, transcendentally deduced through the idea that it's not exactly transcendental deduction either. So it's just let me not try to express what it is or what the method is for coming to it. It's basically just here in the idea that we have to. Here's where we introduce divine will. There must be some agent who is involved with setting the sphere in its motion from the east. Aristotle is wrong to think that that's somehow something that we can arrive at by reasoning, that it would be some kind of a necessitated nature that, therefore we could figure out why it has to be this way. If it did have to be this way, then we could figure it out, and then we wouldn't need to introduce divine will. But precisely because we cannot figure it out, and not just because we aren't trying hard enough, or because we need to work better on our epistemological strengths, but somehow we cannot know this kind of thing, and it is therefore that we introduce divine will as the specifier of these things which are not necessary by nature. For example, that the sphere starts its motion, it moves from the east. The other example that he gives, that he focuses on much more throughout the guide, is the example of matter being in certain ways receptive to celestial form, and in other ways being receptive to terrestrial form, and the idea that a single common matter is, on the one hand, admits of celestiality, and on the other hand, admits of terrestriality. That for him is the main example, not this the sphere moving from the east, although he mentions that one. But the main example that he thinks is the more important one is the one about how one single common matter becomes two. Again, he thinks that is not something which is a necessary order. It's not something where its nature is necessarily, where it has necessary natures that explain that. He thinks that, again, is something that doesn't have a why, that is necessary, and is therefore not something that we could arrive at but not that we could come to know. And that's another example, the main example actually, that he sees as pointing to the divine specifying and divine purpose activities of a divine will. Okay, so let's do a little bit sort of more analysis in way of understanding what's going on here. So the first point is, in his claim that all things exist in virtue of a purpose and not of necessity, I want to say that this claim is either an overreach on Maimonides' part, or perhaps a better way to say it is it's a confusing or maybe better misleading way of saying this, of putting it on Maimonides' part, in ways that I want to highlight. So if you just read this sentence, all things exist in virtue of a purpose and not of necessity, and if you know already that he is opposed to Aristotelian necessity, and you understand that by that is meant he thinks that Aristotle has gone overboard in the way in which he thinks that natures are necessary and that therefore natures are knowable. You might think from that sentence that what he's saying is that, like, in general, he thinks that things aren't that way, that, no, he thinks that things are by a purpose, and that no, Aristotle is way off on the majority or all of his cases of necessary natures, or, in the way that he understands the natures of most things. But this is not the case. Maimonides, of course, affirms vigorously Aristotle on natures for much of the supralunar and sublunar. For example, the spherical motions of the heavens and their permanence, and the fact that they are moving in a spherical and not triangular way. That's something that he thinks Aristotle has a good grasp of. The natures of the four elements, that they are working in a certain way, and that we can understand the whys of change, and that even the details of things like embryology, when those four elements make up terrestrial bodies, and the way that things are organized and ordered, all of that is stuff that he is very clear. He thinks Aristotle has an exactly correct, not just understanding of, but methodologically, that he's right to think that we can know first principles and whys as it relates to that kind of stuff. So, for example, at 220, he talks about the heavens being in a permanent state and unchanging. That's something that he agrees with Aristotle on. He talks about natures, as for the natures below in the sublunar. He says some of them occur always, and others in the majority of cases. And the examples he gives is that, yes, that the natures, always fire heats. And in other cases, when it comes to species, the shapes and acts of individuals of species are in the majority of cases following those natures. And so he uses those as examples that he really thinks Aristotle is right, that we do have access to epistemic inquiries of these kinds of natures, and that we can give whys with respect to these. And also to note, again, these examples from embryology and other cases of things that are necessary for the cultivation of individuals and species. So we might say in this respect, in his honoring of Aristotle in this way, maybe the broader and even maybe more, it's not just broader, but maybe even more illustrative overarching example or point at 219, when he talks about the way in which the differences in the things beneath the spheres are connected up with the motions of the heavens. So he says, with regard to all the differences in the things beneath the sphere, you can make out that they were specified through the powers of the sphere and through the various positions of matter with regard to the sphere, just as Aristotle has taught us. And he actually goes on in this respect, if you trace it, well, he goes on, it was before, Guide 170, many pages before. You can connect this up in his lexicographical chapter on to ride, Rahov. Maimonides talks about God as a rider of the heavens, and in that discussion it gives way to the idea of the heavens as a chariot, and the idea that a chariot implies 4 horses. And then if you read further, and if you sort of follow up in 172, he doesn't make the link himself, but you can easily make the link when he talks in 172 about the 4 forces. So we have 4 horses, here we have 4 forces. Yes, I didn't realize that rhymes in English, but okay. So from horses to forces, we go from 170 to 72. He talks about the 4 forces that arise from the motions of the heavens. And that these are rather significant ones that he agrees with an Aristotelian context. So one is the force that necessitates mixture and composition relating to minerals. Secondly is the force that gives each plant a vegetative soul. Third, the force that gives each animal the animal soul. And fourth, even the force that gives to every rational being a rational faculty or force. And so here is a very, very strong way in which he agrees with an Aristotelian set of ideas, admittedly a Neoplatonized Aristotelian set of ideas, but in any case, in his way of thinking, that these are Aristotelian ideas. And so, again, in all of those details, he is very strongly affirming Aristotle's ideas of natures and the way that natures work and the way that they're connected, etc. And so what's confusing then, or misleading, is that as we have seen, he agrees in content with Aristotle on many supralunar and sublunar details of natures regarding which we can uncover a why. And so again, even those examples at looking at how the heavenly motions connect up with sublunar details, etc. So we see that he agrees on content, but what's confusing or misleading, or if one isn't careful, what can be mistakenly taken away, is that, you think he disagrees with him in general, but indeed he disagrees, at least prima facie, only on these very few cases. And when I say at least prima facie, it's because I don't necessarily think he really does disagree with the sublunar providence example as in the way that it's sort of at a quick read suggests, but let's just leave that aside. So let's just say that he disagrees on only two kinds of cases. The first is certain supralunar details that he says lack a Y, and the examples that we've seen is that the sphere moves from the east as opposed to from the west, or as we've mentioned, the example that he really traces and laces throughout the entire guide as a core example that's important to him is why some parts of matter are disposed to receive celestial form and some to receive terrestrial form. And then the other category of disagreement, again, is just these two categories. Category 1 is the certain supralunar details. Category 2 are some sublunar providence details. You might say that that's a rather big detail, granted, but okay, it's again that ship of righteous people being not like a spider eating a fly. And again, I think there's lots of reasons that this is not as straightforward as it might come across, but and again, based on other textual moments in the guide, but we'll leave that aside for now. So again, he disagrees only in these two areas, and yet he describes all of the examples where he disagrees in terms, he disagrees with Aristotle in terms of necessity. Let me say that again. He only disagrees with Aristotle on these limited cases, and let's not emphasize always, these are two big cases. That's fine. That doesn't that I'm not trying to sneak in that these are tiny examples. These could be very, very big examples of disagreement. That doesn't I can admit that, and that doesn't affect what I'm trying to say here. So he disagrees with these two categories of example, and yet he describes all of the many remaining examples on which he agrees with Aristotle. He describes those in terms of necessity when he's recounting the view as it occurs in Aristotle, but in terms of purpose when he's speaking in his own voice and or for the law. In short, instead of invoking divine will or purpose to account for the small number of contested cases, he opts to frame even Aristotelian content that he affirms and adopts in the non-Aristotelian terms of divine will and purpose. And again, I think it's confusing since it's not clear that what makes that a case, it's not clear what makes that a case of divine will or purpose. And it's also, it's actually confusing for two reasons. One, because again, as we said earlier, it's not entirely clear what the criteria exactly are for making it a case of divine will and purpose. But it's also confusing because, or at least misleading if not read carefully, because it's the same example, like embryology. If you're reading it in terms of his critique of Aristotle, you might think that, oh yeah, that's an example of in terms of necessity. But then he takes those very same details of embryology when he's talking about it himself, and he sees that in terms of divine purpose. Okay, so for example, here at 172, he talks about how the organs of nutrition in their providing for the growth of the body are described, he says that they're described, quote unquote, frequently named nature. And then he himself goes on to gloss that in terms of intended. Again, back to this language of purpose and the conceptual space of purpose. So again, when he's recounting the organs of nature that he wants to describe, he says, oh yes, these have a purpose, these are intended, these are related to divine will, and then he says, oh, they're frequently named nature. Yes, but that's an example of where he does think that Aristotle is right, that we can find first principles and a why. So that would be a pretty good reason to call it nature. So that's an example of this sort of what I find to be just, it's confusing or misleading, or unclear, any of the above. Okay, so again, to see my point, consider his own attempt, what I take to be his own attempt to clarify this very point in his 8 chapters. So he says, the theory generally accepted by people and found in rabbinical and prophetical writings that man's sitting and rising and all of his movements are governed by the will and desire of God is true only in one respect. In other words, talking about divine will being responsible for a human being sitting and rising is true only in one respect. For instance, when a stone is thrown in the air and falls to the ground, it's correct to say that the stone fell in accordance with the will of God, for it is true that God decreed that the earth and all its planets should be at the center of attraction, so that when any part of it is thrown into the air, it is attracted back to the center. Similarly, all particles of fire ascend according to God's will, which preordained that fire should go upwards, but it is wrong to suppose that when a certain part of the earth is thrown upward, God wills at that very moment that it should fall. The Mutakalamun are, however, of a different opinion in this regard, for I have heard them say that the divine will is constantly at work. Okay, back to his concern about avoiding that extreme of the Kalamic occasionalism, atomistic occasionalism. When, therefore, the rabbi said that man rises and sits down in accordance with the will of God, their meaning was that when man was first created, his nature was so determined that rising up and sitting down were to be optional to him, but they did not mean that God wills at any special moment that man should or should not get up. So, in effect, he acknowledges here that ordinary nature cases are only called divine will in a very qualified sense. It's not that there is no nature. That would be to slip into the Kalam view that he's trying to avoid. But we can call them divine will in a qualified way. Well, if he's acknowledging that, then he's also acknowledging that his description of purpose in many, most, perhaps all cases in the guide should also be taken as highly qualified, at least in the cases where he's agreeing in content with Aristotle on things that we can discern a why. So in this spirit, and returning to the two dispute cases, we might demarcate in Maimonides, we might make a distinction between an apparently real difference from Aristotle and an apparently merely linguistic difference from Aristotle, and it's useful to mark these to avoid confusion. So what I mean by these real differences are, again, the superlunar details, certain things that lack a why, and then the sublunar providence that he thinks Aristotle is too anemic with respect to. And again, I'll just add that asterisk, apparently, because I'm not entirely sure what to do with the second example. And also, in light of everything I'm saying now, I'm not entirely sure what to do with the first example. But let's just for the sake of the point that I want to make now, just say that these are at least, if taken on their surface, these are at least real differences between him and Aristotle. And let's just focus for a moment to make that point on just the first one, the certain superlunar details. This would be a real difference. So that Aristotle would be thinking that superlunar details follow from the nature of a thing, and that relates to his real sense of a necessary nature of things, whereas Maimonides is here saying, no, that is not based on some kind of a necessary nature. That actually is the divine will, purpose, doing what it wants. And as he had said earlier, he put it in terms of doing what it wants, and we don't even know the wisdom. And he even said we don't even know if there is wisdom involved. So that would be a genuine difference. That actually, and we might talk about this in later detail in the conversation, but I would note that this difference, as taken as a real difference in views, actually connects up with something that we would find in, let's say, Jewish Neoplatonism and Isaac Israeli, the difference between natural emanation on the one hand, what Israeli calls Zati Jauhari, like an essential substantial mode of relation, which would just be regular natural emanation on the one hand, and on the other hand, Israeli refers to a by power and will by way of influence and action, which is a divine action of some kind that's different in some way from the above. I only mean to make the point that this in Israeli is, let's say again, on the face of it, a real distinction, let's say, between some kind of a natural process and some kind of a divine process, and that loosely maps, without the details of emanation, in the Aristotle case, that loosely maps onto what I mean by real distinction, that they're a real difference. And I don't mean to conjure up real distinction debates from the scholastic issues. I just mean a real difference, that this would be Aristotle thinking that there's something sort of natural going on in the superlunar details, and Maimonides here saying, no, there's something actually that's going on that is not just sort of natural, and that would be what we call divine will. Okay. So that, my point simply to say is that this would be apparently, again, a real difference between the two views. On the other hand, in all of this, there's also something that seems like only a so-called or a semantic distinction. Maimonides often calls an ordinary nature case, one that he would agree with Aristotle we can know the whys for, he often calls that intended and invokes divine will or purpose. but only in a very loose way or a qualified way. That he himself admitted in the 8 chapters, it's a qualified way of talking about something as intended or as divinely willed. Since God is the cause of the cosmos, which let's just say with differences, but that Aristotle, of course, could also agree with, but let's leave that aside. But that since God is the cause of the cosmos, we can loosely talk about cosmic natural processes as willed by him. And that's a merely so-called, in the sense that, of course, Kalam atomists would view these will claims as real differences from a nature claim. Maimonides would not want to say that. In this context, we would say that Maimonides is agreeing that at the natural level that there is a natural process in play. He agrees with Aristotle, not with Kalam, but we can still emphasize it as willed in some loose or qualified sense. So again, this, what I'm calling real difference and the semantic difference, they're obviously interrelated, but this is, to my mind, needs to be thought through more carefully, and it leads to confusions and potential complexities in trying to unpack what he's saying in a given case about divine will. Okay. Furthermore, there seems to be related attention of what I would call 2 divine wills. Let's turn to the providence case briefly. That we said we would sort of hold off on. We'll look at the providence case briefly. We find a tension there between what he wants to claim about divine will in the superlunar case and what he wants to claim about it in the sublunar case. So if we look again to that providence case, in the supralunar case, it seems that Maimonides is trading on Asherite impulses. I'm not saying he's Asherite. I've made clear in this presentation that's precisely what he's not, and he's taking pains to make clear that he's not. But what I mean is it trades in on the Asherite impulse that emphasizes will, not just that emphasizes will, but that emphasizes will at the expense of wisdom. Maimonides' locution there that God, in the case of the supralunar, and his emphasis to show Aristotle just how misguided he is in trying to find whys for why the sphere moves from the east, he says there's where divine will and purpose comes in. We can't even know if wisdom is involved. That's kind of the emphasis, and so that's what I mean. It sort of pushes on this notion of will to the expense of wisdom, almost in an Asherite way, even though he's not Asherite. Whereas when he's arguing against Aristotle in the sublunar providence anemia example, there he seems to precisely trade in on, if we're to say, metazolite impulses. Again, I understand he's not metazolite, but what I mean is here, he seems to be emphasizing the example of a ship of righteous people drowning, that it couldn't be just like the spider devouring a fly. There he seems to be trading in on impulses about divine wisdom of reward and punishment. So again, these are pushing in different directions. In the first one, I say Asherite inflected, he's pushing in a direction that we don't even know if wisdom is involved. And in the other case, he is pushing in a metazolite direction, that this is sort of clearly there's some kind of reward and punishment at play, which is a way of emphasizing divine wisdom, and we can't even know if wisdom is involved. And so this, to me, is a tension that further, with all the other issues, makes it hard to understand what exactly he wants of the divine will, which would be a good thing to know, since the divine will is the most important part of this whole conversation, presumably. Okay, so ending off, let me just deepen this tension by focusing on divine wisdom and its connection with will and essence on the one hand, and by focusing on the importance of the arbitrary in Maimonides and what I'll call taking his own method of sometimes details are not significant seriously. So the first is that in talking about divine will, he clearly, in the guide, and even if he didn't clearly say this, one could clearly deduce from other things he says in the guide, but he also clearly and directly says that the divine will is the same as the divine wisdom, which is one with the divine essence. And so I won't go into detail, but just raise the flag, which says we really need to ask ourselves the question of how a perfectly simple, unified God of the sort that Maimonides pains to develop across the guide, what does it mean for that kind of a God to intend and to purpose and to specify? So let's just leave that as a whole can of worms on its own. But again, that's another example of a kind of flag of like, how are we supposed to take this at face value? And then let's focus and end with the last one, which is on the importance of a methodology of respecting the arbitrary as arbitrary in Maimonides, and how that, again, raises a flag with respect to what are we doing here. So in the criticism of Aristotle's necessity approach to the supralunar, the case of his wrongly assuming that there is an ordinary scientific why to the spheres moving from the east versus the west, Maimonides criticizes Aristotle. Oh, great, we have a phone call coming in. All right, we've shut that down. Maimonides criticizes Aristotle for being too sure about order, even in cases where there is, according to Maimonides, no order, or not the kind of order that Aristotle has in mind. Indeed, it was this situation of what we call here no order that served as the entree to his divine will and purpose. Clearly, if there is no knowable order, is what I should say, then Maimonides seemed to reason there must be some account for why it moves in one way and not the other, and that is inscrutable divine will. But this seems odd, and calls us to think twice about about taking Maimonides at face value, even on methodological grounds alone. For throughout the guide, Maimonides routinely teaches us that sometimes a pipe is just a pipe, or in other words, sometimes an arbitrary detail is just that, arbitrary. And not only does it not warrant explanation, but trying to do so is misleading and without merit. And with this method, we see this method in at least two important examples. The first is at the very start of the guide. Maimonides highlights that some allegories and parables have meaning to every detail, but some do not. In other words, if I say that wisdom is like a pearl in a dark kitchen at midnight, there might not be any reason for why I chose dark kitchen over, say, dark living room, whereas there was absolutely a reason for why I chose dark and midnight over, say, bright and midday. And here, this is from his introduction to the first part. He doesn't use the example exactly as I say it, but it's basically his saying what I'm saying here. So this leads us to ask, why not say that the sphere's motion is kind of arbitrary, like kitchen, and in no further need of analysis? Why feel the need to invoke divine will to explain it? This is a question that, taking Maimonides' own method seriously, demands that we ask Maimonides. And so this is what I mean by an example of a slippage point. Not that, oh, I like to follow Strauss, and so I'm trying to find all kinds of reasons to read it in different ways. No, I'm trying to take Maimonides seriously. Maimonides has given us a very compelling reason to not take certain arbitrary details to not think they need explanation. So why, in this discourse with Aristotle, is he using, how is he just assuming that therefore sphere's motion requires an explanation, and that must be the divine will? It seems it calls for at least taking it, it challenges taking it at face value, or at least the challenges is too strong. It raises a red flag that's worth taking seriously as a red flag based on the text itself and Maimonides' own teaching on methodology. And the other example that I won't go into, Tom Mayhem Mitzvot, the reasons for the commandments, where again he takes it as a very important principle that some details, even in the commandments, are arbitrary and do not need explanation. So I end back with where I began. These are flags to me in Maimonides' account of divine will that relates to his idea of creation. And it is the flags, in the way that I've gone through them, that lead me as one kind of small piece as part of my larger set of criteria for why I am open in my readings of Maimonides to bringing in a Proclean or Avicennian lens and not taking at face value his notions of creation in time, and in addition to the expression existence after non-existence, directly linking us to Avicennian context in which we can speak about divine will and creation ex nihilo directly in terms of eternal emanation. Just again, the method that I hope to have gone through in the paper is the kinds of other little details in looking at what he means by divine will that require further explanation, and so at the very least make legitimate, to my mind, not taking things at face value when he himself is leaving a lot in need of further explanation. Thank you.